right? This is going to be a little bit different than the earlier talk that we did. So instead of a whole lot of data, what I'm going to do is go through a bullet point presentation on some of the insights that we've gained over the last 15 or 16 years. Some of them intuitive, some of them counterintuitive. How it relates to what members should know and how it relates back then to governance. And so as you're going through this, some of it you've heard before, and maybe some of it might be a reminder. There's probably going to be some statement about what we think is really important going forward beyond the financial analysis and what information to use to move that forward for the club's purposes. So you know who we are. I'm not going to go back through that again. Just a reminder of who we are. You know Ray Cronin. Most of you have met Ray or seen Ray talk. He's been a mentor of all of ours, especially managers, and I know even some board members. So he's still with us. And, he's back in Boston now after 2 years in Ireland with his wife, who was the ambassador to Ireland during the Biden years. And he's back and really spending a lot of time on strategic initiatives for our company and really diving into even, I would say, drilling down on detail in terms of the research and running regressions so that we can even build more tools for that. Of course, Jim Butler is our CEO. He's in Chicago and in Naples. I'm going to point out Chris Barron's name here because Chris is the our vice president of private club partnerships, and he is the partner for the part of the MGA north of New York City. So he's the fellow that you work with directly. I handle the partnerships in New Jersey, New York City, and Long Island, just to make that clear. So, and if there's anything that you want from us, please engage with me. And if you're from Westchester County, Fairfield County, Rockland, and all that, I will send that over to Chris and re-engage that way. So with that, so I went the wrong way. Okay, so we're at the end of 2025, and we've learned that data exists. It can and has been studied, and and it makes a difference as long as the people that are looking at the data and trying and listening to the insights from it from an objective viewpoint. That's when you can really get the most mileage out of it. We're in a day and age where there's really data is flying all over the place, right? I mean, everyone talks about data for one purpose or another. Everyone's being surveyed for every little thing in every little business that we're in. The question is, in the club business, how much of that is noise and how much of that can we actually use? And I think that's a really critical point as we go forward. So, when you take that into the boardroom, then the private member-owned club, which we all are, it's a unique blend of business, social interactions, hierarchies, and conflicts of interest. I mean, let's be fair about that. I mean, we have a mixture of industries coming together in one room for an industry that, in a lot of cases, is misunderstood in detail, not misunderstood in general, but in detail. And the private club industry is fragmented. It's a cottage industry. Best practices don't travel very quickly, if at all. It's managed by feel in many boardrooms and in many clubs. Even with the knowledge of insight and data, usually it comes from, but we're different, right? And while it's true that many clubs are different in terms of their culture, the location, their members, maybe even their traditions and history, the fundamental business model of the club, or the financial models, are very consistent across the board. And so are member opinions. So I'm going to bring that into it as we go forward here. But there's also always been that tension of opposites. This is the tension between the management of the club and the board of the club. The tension comes from management wishing to have enough money to operate with and having enough money to apply towards facilities, while the board has oftentimes got its ear to the ground with the loudest voices in the club that are often the vocal minority that are causing them to, maybe think that, all right, we've got to keep this low. We've got to keep things really low. And so getting over that is really the value of data and the insights from studying the industry and not just studying the internal condition that you have at your own club. So you're more in common than not, okay? And that's a good thing to keep in mind. So that from the data then comes processes. Those processes, we believe, should live through and follow through from board to board or management team to management team with vehicles and tools that can be used that actually survive the turnover at the board. Because we think that maybe the turnover at the board level and committee levels is one of the conflicts that we find, along with the conflicts already baked into the business model. You've seen this chart. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I am going to show you a different chart that shows you the difference, the direction of the unrestricted net assets, or a club's net worth, and what it looks like in each one of these buckets. I would say, and I'll point out from the earliest discussion, that one of the most important things, that we believe that as far as the role of the board, is to constantly remind members that they need to think of the club as stewards, or have an ownership mentality instead of maybe a customer mentality. Or like I said before, the renter versus owner mentality. It's vitally important that boards, we believe, and we believe the data shows in our interactions with boards and seeing clubs, that's the one thing that we find missing at clubs that we engage with. But this is the graphic display of those buckets. As you can see, that red line that you see there has a declining net worth year over year. And those clubs aren't going to be around long unless they decide to change that. And I said decide to change that. It's not a condition that needs to persist over time. They can decide to change that. The question is, what are they going to use to convince their membership to do it? Because that turnaround is going to come from the membership body. It's not going to come out of operations, most likely. And it needs to come from members, and it needs to come from a situation where you're going to have more and more members joining the club in those conditions. The yellow line, you see that? It actually has a little bit of growth towards the last few years. This is looking back to 2006, by the way, so it's an entire generation of data. And you can see it was very flat for the first 2/3 of this run, and then the last 4 or 5 years there's been some growth. So overall, they're seeing moderate growth. Right? The question is, what are they going to be doing strategically going forward to keep that upward mobility of that curve? Is it going to continue upward, or is it going to flatten out again? The question there is going to be, how proactive are we going to be in our funding and the thinking on funding? What's our strategic thinking going to be? What vision are we going to provide to the membership, and how are we going to design that vision? So we're going to maybe talk about that just a little bit. And then you see the orange line, which is similar to the yellow, but it's just it's closer to the red. All right, so it's red, orange, yellow, and green. So I went out of sequence there. But those orange groups, they're flat from 2006 to now. They almost have the exact same net worth. They haven't grown in their assets, and they're not declining, but they probably aren't the best versions of themselves. Then you have the green bucket clubs that you see here, that green line, which is very consistently growing year over year, possibly with some magnitude. And those are the clubs that are generating, a break-even margin. That's just the other thing about all these clubs. Almost all of these clubs are breaking even on the operating ledger. All right? So the money that's flowing through the operating ledger is being consumed by the members joining the club. We don't talk about the word fun enough in this business for some reason. When we start talking about data, we talk about budgets. But that's really, that operating revenue, that pays for the fun. and it's consumed every year by members enjoying the club. And there's never that much money left over to really be strategic from a growth of assets perspective. That's why that capital income is so important. Those initiation fees, recurring capital dues, assessments, are the three main vehicles that clubs use to maintain a number above their depreciation line to grow that. Because that money is destined for the most part, for the gross assets, invested in the gross assets. So setting up that conversation, then we go to the conflicts that we see in the club business. Now, there's a book written by Richard Rumelt called The Crux. He wrote a book before that called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. We think those two books are really good strategy books for the club industry, for our particular case, because he really breaks down what strategic thinking should look like in the club business. Starting with the crux, and Ray and our executive team challenged us to think about that. And as a group, we started talking about it. We came down with these two things. Number one, the first conflict that we see is the constant churn in the boardroom. Every year, 3 or 4 new members, maybe 2 members come onto the board every year. So the process of education really has to start all the time, because those people are bringing in their own assumptions, possibly with their own business, possibly with a kind of a type A personality aspect to it, that I know what I'm doing in business and I'm going to bring that to the club. It doesn't always work that way, because there are counterintuitive aspects to the club business model, as we know. And so, we find that there are certain departments that really rise to the top of that list when it comes to whether it's the right assumption or the wrong assumption. Food and beverage would be at the top of that, and there are others, but that's really the key lightning rod issue that almost every club battles with all the time, unless they've made a visionary choice to do it one way or the other. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. The second conflict is in the club culture itself. All right, we are member-owned organizations. Our members are our only customers, and yet we get to choose the prices for ourselves. And so it's different than any other business model you can think of. I'm a former restaurant owner of 15 years. You can imagine how long I would have been in business if I had said, okay, you're 50 people having dinner tonight. Well, what do you want to pay? Right? Well, it's not going to work, right? In a nickel and dime industry like restaurants. And so it's what happens because of that. We typically aren't raising our prices too high, right? And human nature would be, I know we've talked about this a bunch, but human nature would say we're probably not going to ask enough. And that's governed a lot by the loudest voices in the club, possibly even the minority, or that vocal minority that we all know about. And so making sure that there's always enough money to deliver a compelling membership experience. How do you know what that is? That there's enough money to field the staff necessary. How do you know that you're doing that? And are members contributing the capital necessary to consistently meet the obligatory and aspirational needs of the club looking forward? And what are we going to base that on? All right? And then who decides and how do we know? All right? And we say that it's process and data that gets you there. Ultimately, encouraging boards to go from operational leadership over to strategic leadership. We've learned that operating boards that are really stuck in operations are stuck in operations because they don't have enough money to talk about from a strategic standpoint. All right? They're really stuck in the operations. The clubs that are more strategic are actually generating capital funds to actually tell their members what the plans are for the future and how we're going to spend that money. So the key then is generating that capital income so you can have strategic discussions about the 5-year vision of the club, let's say. So I'm going to go through some bullet points here. Some of them I'm going to color, some of them I'm not. All right? You'll have access to this for future reference. So the fundamentals of our business model. Number one, as clubs, we provide a social and leisure experience on a campus in exchange for dues and fees. Everyone agrees with that? Members carry expectations of their social and leisure experience, known as the membership experience, the most critical of which is food and beverage. Now, I'm in a big group of room. We're here from the Golf Association, so that sounds like it could be, counterintuitive, right? How do we know that? We're not just saying that from an opinion standpoint. We know this from thousands and thousands of member surveys that have given us input about the most important amenity in their club, what's the most used amenity in the club, and what do they want more out of those amenities. And universally, in clubs with golf, food and beverage, member dining always rises to the top as the most important amenity to members. And yet it's always the lowest rated. Okay? So in contrast, golf is usually 2 or maybe even 3 on that list of importance, believe it or not. I think we've only had 1 club out of the hundreds that we've done where golf rose to the number 1 amenity. Okay? So that's an aberration. Everybody else, it was number 2 or even number 3, mostly 2. yet it's the highest rated. We use a 7-point scale in our surveys, and the average rating of a club's golf course across all of the surveys is 6.5. That means half of the respondents are saying it's a 6, and the other half are saying it's a 7. All right? We know that golf courses, golf course maintenance combined with golf operations, the golf shop side of it, the money-making side of it. We subsidize that, on average, about 35% of the dues dollar goes towards the deficit in funding golf. Right? 35%. And it's the highest rated amenity, but it's the second most important amenity. Now, contrast that with food and beverage. The median food and beverage dues subsidy is about 15%. It's the same in MGA as it is nationally. And yet it's the lowest rated amenity. Is there a correlation between what we say, the importance of the amenity, to the resources we put into that amenity, to the actual rating from an member satisfaction perspective? I'll leave that question kind of open on that. I don't know all the answers to that, but we believe and we know that in discussions with boards that we never talk about the loss coming out of the golf side, but we hyper-focus on the deficits in food and beverage. There seems to be a tug of war, and it's a choice, all right? And so that's just a question I will pose that to. These are things that we learned from the survey process. So that leads us to the next thing. Professionals work to deliver on that member experience in a manner that meets or exceeds member expectations. So how are we determining member expectations? Are you doing regular surveying? Whether it's an annual survey, it's what we would call a cumulative survey, maybe coupled with pulse surveys along the time. What are you doing with that data? And what metrics are you using to help determine that member experience? And then that leads right to the budget. The budget is necessary to deliver that membership experience. So if we're not getting that information from members, how do we know what to budget? And we're gonna say that all the years that we've been doing this in club benchmarking, we've really been focused on the financial model and trying to get the insights from that from a financial management perspective. But we're learning now that sometimes there's a reluctance in board and management teams, not to call anybody out here, but there's a reluctance to really come to grips with the financial model sometimes and have honest discussions about it. Sometimes it's just, and I know for myself, I'm a food and beverage guy. My DNA is culinary, even though I'm a lifelong golfer. So for some reason, golf is my first life, but I chose the food and beverage and business, so therefore I don't enjoy golf anymore because I can't play. Too many hours. But anyway, that's another point. But, so my point is establishing a budget, whether it's operating budget or capital budget, if we don't know precisely what our members are saying, kind of using the example from earlier today, that type of thing, it's kind of hard to then budget something that's going to meet your vision. So there's a tension of opposites here. So we have a vision for the club that maybe 5 years out or longer. Are we going to budget to that vision, or are we going to fit the budget or fit the vision to a budget that we think our members will expect because it keeps dues around the same and it's fairly the same year over year? So that leads us to the second point then, that member expectations are the financial model related to the business model. So we would say that, just using food and beverage as a punching bag, we would say that from a financial standpoint, looking at the data, understanding that most clubs, 93% or more, have a deficit in F&B. Not all clubs can be wrong, right? That many clubs can't be wrong in that approach. Is that understanding the membership expectations may trump the financial result in that department. Knowing that our golf has been put on a pedestal and is performing very well, but even at a 6.5 at your club, membership satisfaction in golf, that's every club. It doesn't get, we've never seen a club below 6 in all the surveys we've done. Yet food and beverage is like 4.9, 5.0, and consistently right there, due to a lack of, I believe, understanding of how important it is to members at the club. So the things that members should know. Clubs are a high fixed cost business, and it's a very capital intense business. Our capital intensity ratio across the club industry is about 300%. So $3 of gross assets to provide $1 of annual operating revenue. That's capital intense. That requires that requires detailed data so that you understand that, so you can keep that experience. There's a direct line between keeping your capital assets up to date and the membership side of things. The club's footprint, plus the depth and quality and breadth of the membership experience, drives the operating expenses and that membership experience, which means it drives the dues rate. We've discovered a dues regression using gross assets and your approach to the amenity subsidy. Most clubs' amenity subsidy is about 50%. In other words, 50% of your dues is funding the deficits from your amenity packages. Golf is a deficit, tennis is a deficit, food and beverage is a deficit. So across those amenities, about 50% on average is your dues. That other 50% is the overheads, buildings, maintenance, property tax and insurance, and G&A. All right, so those two come together to run a regression. You can actually predict what your dues should be within a 92% range of accuracy. All right, and then there's some variations that go into that, but you don't have to guess anymore. You don't have to look around your neighborhood and say, well, this club is 10,000, this club is 14,000, that club's 20. We're somewhere around 12. That happens, right? That happens a lot. But your footprint and your members' expectations in combination actually dictates the expenses it takes to run your operation. Thus, it helps you, create what that dues ought to be. So expenses aren't bad. Expenses are the things that membership consume to enjoy the club. And if there's a constant effort to reduce those expenses, it could be injurious to the membership experience overall. Okay? So the lowest rated and most important amenity is food and beverage. We beat that up already. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Clubs compete on the value offered, not the price that they charge. That's the difference between the red bucket clubs and the green bucket clubs, by the way, is that statement right there. The green bucket clubs have become successful because they have a higher value proposition to their members and to their future members through constant improvement and constant adding of new things. The red bucket clubs are competing on the price they pay. They've worked off of the assumption for too long that if we keep our initiation fees low and we keep our dues low, we'll have more members. Data suggests that's not true. In fact, the clubs that have the most value, they have the highest initiation fees. They have the highest dues per member, and they also have the most members. And some of these clubs are right next door to each other, right? Doesn't matter where you are. It's that way in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It's that way on Long Island and New Jersey and probably around here too. So members at every club are responsible for properly funding the club so that it can compete successfully over time. We have a situation internally at all of our clubs that when we have a hockey stick recovery, right, and we all know what that means, right? So if you're in the public realm, like a restaurant, and you're seeing your returns dipping down, you have to rely on the outside market to react to whatever changes you're making to save you. In most cases, restaurants that find that they don't survive that. They actually go down. In a club, we have a built-in mechanism to correct a hockey stick recovery, and that's our membership internally. We can almost do it overnight with objective thinking. Just to keep going here a little bit. So let's talk about the fiduciary aspects. So we're going to link everything now to governance. So the board's fiduciary duty is to both the members and the corporation. But which comes first? We would say that the key primary fiduciary duty of a club's board is no different than the board of a corporation or any business at all, and that is to preserve and grow the assets of the organization. Okay, so are all boards thinking like that? Is that what they're talking about in the boardroom, or are they talking about how are we going to get the operating budget back into line? Okay, and the second one is to the members, and that's being responsible to the members by really educating the members on what they can do to help the club move forward and understand their role in that. So those are a couple of two missing things there. There are some misconceptions sometimes at the board level and committee levels because they haven't gone through all this in detail maybe, or taken, provided their club's data and looked at that and benchmarked it, that our fiduciary responsibility as a board is to keep things as affordable as possible without upsetting the apple cart. You hear things like, not on my watch, okay, things of that nature. But all that does is prolong an issue, we find, and it disables the club's ability to take advantage of the power of compounding, which is really important because everybody understands the power of compounding in your own lives. But if the club hasn't kept up with that or enabled the club to do that, then it becomes a harder and heavier lift every year to get caught up on capital maintenance and on member experience issues. So the clubs that are well governed, they practice thoughtful, constant evolution. In other words, they're always thinking about what's the best version of ourselves and how are we going to get that done and how are we going to establish that. We believe that a traditional top-down strategic thinking or strategic planning misses the point in a lot of ways because that's done in boards where you have long-tenured members for the most part that are probably above the average age of the club, maybe not, I'm just saying in general, that they may not know the pulse of the lesser tenured members who have joined the club in the last 5 years. We believe in a bottom-up strategic thinking model, which starts with understanding the members' expectations and their opinions on where the club is from a satisfaction point of view and a net promoter score point of view. We also believe that, like to Joe's point, is understanding where your employees are in that, and understanding their engagement and their net promoter score. I can tell you the median net promoter score for members is about 41, 42. Okay? The median employee engagement, the ones that we measured, is like 15. So there's a big disconnect there. I'm not going to go into a lot of there, but still, education of all the key stakeholders is paramount to the club's success. And that's why we're kind of shifting gears at club benchmarking. Instead of just talking about finance, connecting finance to the bottom-up data collection of member satisfaction, understanding that, and then connecting the dots to what that means from a budgetary perspective. So understanding that the financial concepts, not every member is going to understand that the operating ledger of the club is not the financial driver. They're not going to always understand that it's the capital ledger that drives the club financially. But it's not hard. You'll understand it, they'll understand it. And distinguishing the difference between operating ledger and capital ledger is vital in that. And move forward. It's the footprint concept. I already talked about this. This is the idea of quantifying and doing an actual regression on those two metrics, your gross assets and your amenity subsidy, historically speaking, and then regressing that. We do this automatically for our benchmarking clients, and we provide that number once a year to everybody. Then there's a discussion around that. None of this is declarative. It's not a rule. It gives you here's what your regression says. Here's what you charged in dues last year. It came up to like $6 million, let's say. But the regression is putting a number out that looks like $6.5 million. Okay? So there's a $500,000 delta between what our regression produced versus what you charged, and then we go through and look at the rest of the metrics. So it's like a step-by-step thing. So this is just a review of the operating ledger. When we're talking to members, this is how we convey it. The operating ledger is for the enjoyment of the membership experience. It's how you pay for the fund. The money you put into that is consumed every year. There's nothing left over for the most part to really do anything for the capital side. The capital ledger is the obligations as a member or as an owner. And I'm talking about obligatory and capital. And the thing about the operating ledger, we say that from an expense standpoint, and people argue with us all the time, but we'll suggest that the expenses it takes to run the club on the operating ledger, the more you apply to it, the better. Because, we found that the group of managers that we work with are very, very good at managing budgets. If you budget for it, they're going to make that budget. Boards get what they want in the budget process, sometimes regardless of the data, right? But hopefully with the data. So the more you can put to that experience, the more likely it is you're going to be able to evolve and improve that experience. And if you're measuring member satisfaction in NPS, you're going to see it come out on that. Talked about this a little bit in the first session, and this is the best practice of matching capital dues or some vehicle to your obligatory capital. It's absolutely essential that you have some tool that has quantified your obligatory capital, whether it's a capital reserve study or an asset evaluation. And the idea there is that that document has to be kept up religiously over the course of the year and then redone and then redone and redone and kept up, because things are getting out of hand in terms of replacement cost values for things like HVAC, golf course equipment, kitchen equipment. They're highly specialized equipments, and they don't stay the same year over year. In fact, there's way beyond CPI on some of this stuff year over year. And so to have that constantly updated, including the out-year pricing on the replacement stuff that you haven't done yet, is vitally important to have that accurate tool available to you. And then, of course, initiation fees matched up to your aspirational capital. And of course, being part of the best version of yourself and making sure that initiation fee is tied to something, a metric that you can measure. We use unrestricted net assets divided by your full member equivalent, and then compare that number to your initiation fee to kind of get a read, because we know what the industry says about that. The median initiation fee is 1.7 times your unrestricted net assets divided by full member equivalent. If you're below 100%, most likely you're offering your initiation fee out of somewhat of a scholarship. All right, but the median is at 1.7 times that number, and every club can do that. The only time that you can't do that, I think, off the balance sheet is when if you're a club that doesn't depreciate your assets. If you're a club that doesn't depreciate your assets, most likely you're not even logging to gross assets, so your balance sheet really is not a good guide. So we have to use different methods to come up with it when we don't have this situation. I would say 30% of clubs in the MGA do not depreciate or they expense their assets, and therefore it's not represented on the balance sheet accurately. But there are other ways to do it, and that's through quantification. So with clubs with golf, we look at the net to gross ratio, and what I'm just showing you here is all clubs with golf in the country and the spread that we see there. You got the red, the orange, the yellow, and the green. This is the relationship between your net book value of property and plant and the gross value of property and plant. The higher the ratio, the fresher your asset base is. The green bucket clubs are at the 75th percentile or higher, probably around 52%. Okay, the yellow bucket clubs start at about 46%. The yellow buckets are in that 35 to 40, and the red buckets are way down in 25, 26%. And so that's that is a measurement of how fast your assets are depreciating by book value. Again, if you're a club that doesn't book depreciation, you're not going to get this ratio. But I'll just add that just to give you a point of reference, if you look at Ritz-Carlton and Four Seasons, especially the resort side of things, their target for this ratio is about 72%. Okay? Now those two organizations are dependent on return traffic from their guests, and they're the best in the hospitality industry at return guest traffic. It's vitally important that they always have fresh assets so that they can maintain that level of repeat, like 93% repeat ratio. And the only thing that gets in the way of them achieving that is oftentimes those hotels and resorts are owned by third-party private equities. Those private equities want distributable cash, and sometimes distributable cash will keep their CapEx investment in check over a period of time, but ultimately they have to make those investments regularly, and clubs are really no different. So getting back to this is just a slide that updates that slide that I showed you before, and this is compound annual growth rate of a club's unrestricted net assets. It's the most important metric to pay attention to and to teach members about. Because this is going to come off of your net available capital. That's the combination of your operating and capital incomes. And if you're growing at 5.7% over time or better, you're going to be in very good shape over time. You're going to be able to keep up with your capital run rate, and you're probably going to have enough aspirational capital to apply on a regular interval. Aspirational capital is something that's not spent at every club every year, but maybe every 5 years something happens. 7 years ago, we didn't even know what pickleball was, right? Now look at it. Padel's another one, if you're a club that is more than just a golf club. But the clubs that in the red, you can see it's a 25% split, and we're encouraging clubs to look at this metric and find a way strategically to start meeting a growth pattern in the compound annual growth rate of capital, because that's the way out. And then what it is, finally, in the red bucket clubs, they just don't have any capital, and the green bucket clubs are generating capital. That's the big difference. And all those other factors feed into it, owners versus customers, and then the competing on price versus value. All those things feed in to what ultimately happens to the club on this bottom line. So finally, as I'm running out of time, I'm going to correlate something to it. I'm going to go back to a subject on membership satisfaction. We've discovered a regression on that I think would be interesting. Now, we mentioned before that the golf portion, the golf amenity at clubs with golf is typically by members ranked as at least the second most important or most used amenity. And that the average score is about 6.5 out of 7, so it's very high. And it's also the most subsidized amenity in the club. So there might be a correlation there. We've learned about the food and beverage, because food and beverage is usually ranked, remember dining is usually ranked the highest among members in terms of importance or frequency of use, and yet it's the lowest. We've noticed too that when food and beverage rankings are really low, like 4.9, 5.0, 5.1 out of 7, we've noticed that the member satisfaction with governance and member satisfaction with management is also low. So and it's tied directly to the food and beverage satisfaction score, believe it or not. And so a focus on the satisfaction score for members of food and beverage, as that goes up, so does member satisfaction with governance and member satisfaction with membership. That's something we've discovered by looking at these surveys. That's why we believe that understanding the membership's level of satisfaction is vitally important for members' commitment to the club and their confidence in the board and management in order to make the decisions that are necessary to move the club forward financially. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. So it just, we don't think it can be understated. So then we look at the net promoter score. Now, this isn't a 7-point scale. This is an 11-point scale. And it's based on a couple of questions. One question is, how likely are you, based on your experience at the club, to promote the club to other members or to new members, things of that nature. Other related questions would be, are you willing to bring non-family guests to the club for any reason, whether it be food and beverage or golf? All right, all those feed into the NPS score. So responses that are 0 to 6 are detractor scores, okay? The scores in the 7s and 8s are passives, and the scores at 9 and 10 are your promoters. And so the promoter score is based on how many promoters you have as a percentage of total respondents minus the number of detractors you have as a percentage of that, and that's how you get to the number. So the best clubs are performing above 50 on this, all right? That's 72, we would say, is world class on the net promoter score. The median club is at 40 right now, and the low NPS clubs, in the 20s and below. Just to give you a little background on this, cable companies are about 18. Okay. And so it's pretty interesting when you look at that. And what we've also learned about the NPS score is that when we see a lower NPS score, we're also going to see low food and beverage, governance, and management scores. The higher the NPS score, the higher the food and beverage, governance, and management is. And it's the Net Promoter Score that's really measuring loyalty and attachment to the club. Vitally important metric. And finally, we're getting down to the end of it here. But this is looking at member satisfaction by generation in the club. And one thing that I'll point out is that when you look at overall satisfaction, value, and Net Promoter Score, look at where the millennials are in that box all the way to the left versus the folks that are baby boomers or even silent generation, the older, most tenured members. So of the naysayers in your clubs, if it's like most of the clubs that I've run into, most of the naysayers are in the baby boomer and silent generation category. Yet they're the most loyal to the club, and they give the club the highest marks. Yet they come to dinner every night and they complain the most. Right? So the thing about the detractors is it's okay to listen to them, but don't govern by the detractors. We're going to say that the biggest section on the NPS score is going to be the 7s and 8s, the passives. And it is, we're saying that the detractors in the NPS are the smallest group. The largest group is usually the passives, and then there's the promoters. So who should we be concentrating on to move to promoter? The passives. And that's going to help you govern to the happy instead of governing to the people that speak the loudest, who are never going to leave the club and they're never going to be happy with it. Right? You can listen to them all you want. You say, thank you very much, we're going to move over here. We're going to listen to these folks. And so it's a little concerning when you look at the millennial score, because those are the 42-year-olds that are joining the club most recently. And they're going to be the ones that are going to be joining the club for the next 10, 12 years. And so what can we do about increasing their overall satisfaction, their perception of value, and their NPS? And so that I would just leave that as kind of like, what do you think? And my last statement on here is, I'll go back to it because I already made the statement, and I said, how can we possibly budget properly without knowing what our members' opinions are about the operation? Doing it out of the boardroom or on the word of others that come into that, it probably is best served being supported by data. And I'm not trying to beat a horse to death here, but we believe it's vitally important to be focused on member satisfaction for reducing attrition, for increasing people knocking on the door to join the club, and increasing and generating the capital that you need and the operating revenue that you need to ever evolve that membership experience. So I'll end with this. Peter Drucker, who was a kind of an HR guru from the 50s and throughout the 60s and into the 70s, and talked a lot about management and leadership. And he once said that leadership or right management is doing the thing right, and leadership is doing the right thing. Just to connect something that we've learned, one of the reasons why all clubs aren't in that green bucket, one of the things that an attribute of the red bucket clubs, for instance, is too much of a focus on efficiency without a focus on sufficiency, right? And so being efficient might be doing the right things, and we know from looking at budget performance club to club to club that management teams are really good at that. So they're not wasting. It's important to point that out. Waste is not something that we see a lot in the club industry, even though some of the things we have to do to please members can look wasteful. Like when you go into the Sunday brunch buffet and it looks just as good at 10 a.m. as it does at 2 p.m., all right? Not all that food's getting eaten, right? But anyway, that's one thing. But but that's what's necessary to keep that value perception going. So that but this is where things get difficult in the boardroom, we find, and finance committee. And as the right thing changes as volunteer leaders churn. So as new personalities come in, we tend to be managing from the cult of personality first, and then we bring the data in, and hopefully we get everybody aligned on the right. That's what slows boards down, okay? And so what if the president believes, for instance, that the right thing is to break even food and beverage, or to not raise my dues on my watch? Almost every member has a different view of the right thing. I know you've probably heard Ray Cronin say it before, and I'll say it now. It says, every club is one bad board away from a debacle. All right? And he's kind of right. You know, so that continuity and what kind of tools are you going to use to keep the thing flowing and moving forward in a positive way? One way, understand your members and communicate with your members on what is expected out of them, what you need from them on an incremental way and a proactive way, so that everybody can be on more or less the same page. You know, we can be efficient without being effective, and that's a problem. We think effectiveness is probably the most important aspect of any club from a governance point of view or management point of view. Too often, the club finance and board efficiency is assumed to be missing when there's a department deficit. It's never talked about in those terms with golf, but it is in food and beverage. So, with that, are there any discussion points or questions you want to talk about? Because I just went through everything. It's almost 15 minutes after 12. I know I'm standing in the way of lunch. I'm going to do that. Yes, sir. How you doing?
Four buckets of capital. Do you have a dollar amount? Like bucket one spends 500, bucket 2 million?
It really is. The question was, is there a dollar amount in there? It's really about compound annual growth rate, because every club is starting from a different position. And so your 5% growth next year, it's going to be a different number than the club down the road. You might be higher, it might be lower, but you know there are clubs in the red bucket that are below zero in their net worth. And so for them to grow at 5%, it's going to be another number that's negative. And then it's going to go up. So it's a small amount of money. But when you get into the clubs that have had a consistent growth, let's say they're worth 20 million, that 5% is worth a lot more in the dollar value, but it's the same percentage, right? So it really is based on your footprint. There's no predetermined dollar amounts there. It's all about growth percentage and ratios. Yes, sir. Yes, absolutely. MGA has it, and it'll be available as a PDF.
And how many clubs are you seeing using strategic planning to drive budgeting compared to CPI?
Too many clubs are using CPI. And we know that that's not going to rule the roost. What should be governing the budget process is member expectations, and the footprint that you have at the club is really what's going to dictate what those budgets ought to be. And understanding those two things is really changes the trajectory of the discussion in a positive way, I find.
Ken,
Yes?
I fully understand the net worth growth concept, but for those clubs that do not depreciate, is there a similar measure that they should focus on, whether it's capital expenditures, or FME, or something like that?
Yeah. There's a couple of things on that. I've worked with some of the clubs in that category, and so there's a surrogate way of filling in the blanks. It's kind of like Jurassic Park, where they had the mosquito DNA, and they put it in, there's holes, so they put a frog's DNA in. So we've learned that there's some surrogate data that we can plug in that'll get to a reasonable answer from a directions perspective. Talk about that in a second, because we studied that with Condon and Mira, who I know a lot of you work with them. The other way to do it is to do a quantified asset study so that we understand exactly what you have and all that. So some of the clubs that I've dealt with, they have really like 16 million in gross assets, and that really represents land, maybe a big building that was built 30 years ago. But when we did the asset study, we found that they actually have 70 million in assets. And it's like, oh, really? But they know that instinctively. The way to do it from a surrogate standpoint, when we studied this with the guys at Condon, was is taking your operating revenue, we always know what that is, and then applying the capital intensity ratio to that. So let's say operating revenue at 10 million, and we're going to apply a 300% capital intensity ratio, which is right around the median for the industry. So it could be higher, it could be lower. That would then be a $30 million footprint using that, because we have enough data to say that that's a reasonable starting point, and then you take it from there. Okay? And then there's your depreciation to operating revenue. So we could say that, okay, if you have 20 million in operating revenue, we know that the median depreciation to operating is about 11%. So we can do that. Once we do the capital intensity one, we go, okay, that's 30 million. We know that the median depreciation value by gross assets is 4%. So we do 4% of 30 million or 11% of operating and kind of triangulate into it, but it's still just a discussion starter. And once that depreciation number is established, the rest of the thing that we did with Condon, there was an article written about a year ago with one of our guys in Sal from Condon, and they said once you have that depreciation number figured out, and most clubs know what that is, but the clubs we're talking about, we manufactured that number, then you look at it and say, what's our 10-year need in obligatory capital? You take that depreciation number for 1 year or current year, multiply it by 20 times, and that's going to be very close to your 10-year capital rate, and then divide it by 10 to get to like a 10-year, 1 year average. And so it's been pretty consistent, and it's based on real data. So, sorry, that was lengthy. Yes?
You mentioned earlier, the golf course is subsidized, but it was 35%, food and beverages, 15%. But does that include the fact that many clubs do golf outings and those weddings and the like that are profitable, especially say they make $1 million of gross margin dollars? Does that go into that calculation and therefore the subsidy is higher than that 15%, but that's not in the calculation?
It's in there. And so the question is what's the effect on lucrative events like weddings and outings on the operating? At the preponderance of clubs, and every club does outings, every club does weddings to some degree. Some are more active in it. I know your club is, which is great. It's a great way to defray the expenses to the membership experience, but most of those clubs are actually doing an overall break even in their operations. And so the profit from all those events is going into a break-even scenario at most clubs, unless you're producing an operating surplus every year. Most likely than not, it's going to be part of a break-even. So it's funding the operations, but it's not funding capital. Okay, and so you say, what's the financial benefit of doing those then? Well, the financial benefit of doing it is maybe you can provide more to the membership experience as it relates to the operating side, like a la carte, and so maybe you can do more things to the golf course when they have downtime, things of that nature. In some cases that money just ends up staying in members' pockets actually, because there's a belief that we're producing all this lucrative income, and that's a financial benefit to the club. But if it's going to a break even on operations, the club's not really getting the financial benefit that would lead to a profit or an NOI. It's being used in other ways. And so you could say that the money that you're making on those is actually defraying what you would otherwise charge the members. You could say that. Yeah. Again, sorry for the length. Anyway, I've enjoyed being here today. Thank you very much.